Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Charles Galofre, and today I'd like to talk to you about opening principles. By the end of this lecture, hopefully you'll have a much better understanding on how to play the beginning phase of a game, and also just better explanations and illustrations on a lot of the rules that you just don't understand. So one of the things that I think should be explained to kind of understand the dynamics of the pieces and the struggle that's going on between white and black in the opening phase of the game is to understand the board. And the reason why that is because the first thing that needs to be pointed out is that white actually controls half of the board. Okay, and that's white side. And for blacks, it's everything from the 5th rank to the 8th rank. Okay, so they both share an equal amount of space. Now, the second thing that needs to be understood is the relationship of the pieces compared to the board. And the way we do that is to observe a piece on a center square. And the center squares, just to point that out, are these 4 squares right here. Okay? So by placing a piece in a center square, we realize that the piece actually could move to 8 squares in this case. And if we placed a knight on the A1 square, it could move to 2 squares. The piece can move to 13 squares, and here it moves to 6 squares. Now, by following that exercise, if we place every single piece in the center and on the corner of the board, we realize that the closer a piece is to the center, the more squares it can move to. Okay, so what do we learn about the pieces in relation to the board and the center? And that's that the closer the pieces are to the center, the more squares it can move to. And the value of a piece is judged by the amount of squares or possibilities it has. So the closer the pieces are to the center, the more valuable they are. Okay. Now, with that said, I could say that a great chess player said that the player who controls the center, in essence, controls the game. Okay. Now that we understand that both sides control an equal share amount of space, and that the closer their pieces are to the center, the more squares the pieces cover, so in other words, the more space they control, then we can start explaining as to what's going on. You see, the first moves in a chess game are really a battle of space and time. What you're trying to do is to develop your pieces as quickly as possible, and you're trying to gain as much space as possible in your opponent, because we could really say in an abstract way that a chess game is a game of timing or of time. White is trying to get to, or you're trying to get to your opponent's king before he gets to yours. Okay? Now, let's elaborate on this. So some guidelines or the main rules or goals for the opening are the following. Okay? What you should always strive for is to develop your pieces as quickly as possible. That's the first thing. The second thing is you should centralize your pieces. And the last thing is to open lines for your pieces. So a quick recap. Develop your pieces as quickly as possible. Okay, and as quickly as possible should be underlined. Centralize your pieces, and centralize should be underlined. And then the last thing is open lines for your pieces. And in parentheses, you could put attack. Okay? Now, because there are a lot of opening principles, what I like to do is actually to go back a few moves and to explain the pieces in relation to the opening. Okay, so we're going to start off with the pawns, and obviously we have to start with the pawns because it's basically how we measure chess, through pawns, and also because in the opening, pawns, we have to move our pawns to be able to develop our pieces. So what are some common principles that we hear? The first principle is you should only develop with your king pawn and your d pawn. Those are the only pawns you should move in an opening. That's one. The other one is you should only move 2 pawns in the opening. And then other things you hear is that the more pawns, you should prevent moving too many pawns, or the more pawns you move, the more weaknesses you create. Alright, so a quick explanation of all of these principles is the following. because the opening phase is about time and space, um, the big issue with pawns is really time. Okay, it's an issue of timing because what you're supposed to be developing in a chess game are your pieces, and so that leads us to a good principle, and that's that these are the pieces, and those are the ones you should be developing, and the ones you should not be developing are these right here, not the pawns. Okay, so with that said, a move like e4 actually is helping white develop as quickly as possible, which is the first goal. Why? Because if you compare that move to any other moves, this is the one move that you could do as a first move that accomplishes all the goals, and I mean it does a lot more than any other of the other moves, even the move d4. Okay, so let's go over that real quick. So we go e4. We're promoting the development as quickly as possible. We're centralizing. Why? Because we have some central control here, and also because we're giving our pieces access to this. Oh, excuse me, and also because we're giving our pieces access to the center. And excuse me, there you go. And in addition to that, we're also opening lines for pieces because, as you can see in the illustration, now that the king pawn has moved, the bishop and the queen have access to more squares. Okay, so the other principle that we hear is that white should only restrict themselves to 2 pawn moves and no more. Now, like I said, the issue is more about timing because we want to develop our pieces, not our pawns, okay? And so typically it's 2 pawn moves because we need to move the pawns to be able to give way for our bishops. And a good example would be, let's say white plays knight to f3, and then black plays d6, and white plays bishop to c4. Okay, and a quick observation here would be that the next pawn that white will have to play will be d3 or d4, so that he could develop his c1 bishop. Okay. Notice how the pawns that we choose to move are actually pawn moves towards the center. They have more influence over the center, and in comparison to moves like a3 or h3, or a4 or h3. Okay, all right. Now that we spoke about pawns, I think the next piece that we could talk about would probably be knights. Okay. And the reason why we should talk about knights next is because it's actually the piece that you should be developing next in a chess game after you move a pawn. And as funny as that may sound, okay, so what are some of the common principles? A knight on the rim is dim, right? So for instance, this is the side of the board, and so that would be considered the rim. And so they say that this is a bad move, and we'll talk about that. And also develop your knights before your bishops. Okay? Now, why should we develop our knights before our bishops? Well, when we talk about developing our knights before our bishops, what we're talking about is quality of development and also flexibility. Okay, so let's see that. An example, knight to f3, knight to c6 in this position. Okay, we take into account the position of the knight on b1 and the position of the knight on g8. We see that the knight on b1 only has 2 squares to move to, and the other knight has 3 squares to move to. Okay, now if we consider the squares that both knights have, we know that the knight on b1, if he moves to a3, that would be a suboptimal move. Those are not the type of moves that you want to be playing in the opening. Why? Because you want to develop your pieces not only as quickly as possible, but to the best squares as possible. And that's where development quality applies. Okay, so in essence, okay, let's talk about this knight right here real quick. An e2 is not that good of a square. The best square would always be f6 because it controls the most amount of squares possible. Okay, so in essence, why do we develop our knights before our bishops? Because when we develop our knights, we have very limited options, And we know that by placing them, because of that, we know that we are placing them on their best squares. Okay. And the flexibility aspect of developing our knights before our bishops is that the other minor piece that we're going to be developing, and the one that we'll talk about next, is our bishops. And because bishops actually have greater access and more flexibility to more squares, we usually want to be able to develop them to their best square in one move instead of two. Okay, that's also a part of timing. So for instance, let me show you an example. In this position, bishop to d3, and I really don't know that many opening principles with the bishops. I could say that maybe I know two, and okay, so I'll talk about them in this example. This one right here, bishop to d3. Okay, white has more than one option: bishop e2, bishop d3, bishop c4, and bishop to b5. Okay. Now, bishop to d3 is quite possibly the worst of those options, because bishops are pieces that belong in diagonals. And so in that sense, the placement of the bishop on c4 would have been a much better placement of the piece. Why? Because it's a very nice diagonal, and on top of that, it has influence over the center. Okay? Remember, the closer to the center, the more squares it can move to. Okay? In addition to that, by placing the bishop on d3, this bishop really doesn't have that many prospects. It's really just facing his pawn, so it doesn't have that many squares, and on top of that is hampering the development of the bishop on c1. Okay? Because ideally we like to develop our center pawn and then develop our bishop. Right? Alright. What are the other principles that I know about the bishops in the middle game? Well, a good example would be the following. Sorry, in the opening, but like I said, there are more middle game factors. Bishop to c4, d6, bishop to c4. Now in this position, if we observe black's position, we see both of the bishops, and we could say that typically we know we're talking here about good pieces and bad pieces, okay? And this is just in terms of the bishops, so that you don't get confused. The bishop would be considered the good bishop because the pawns are not placed on his color, and therefore that bishop has more squares to move to. And because the center pawns are placed on black squares, the f8 bishop actually has less squares to move to. And as you can see, that that seems to be the case. That's the first thing with the bishops. And so ideally, how black would like to develop is the following: knight to c6, bishop to c4, now bishop to c5. You see, the bishop develops outside the position. So if d3, d6, now both bishops actually have healthy diagonals, because this bishop wouldn't be considered inferior anymore because it's outside of the pawn chain. Okay? And the other thing, another typical case with bishops is the following. And it has to do with exchanging the bishops. Okay, and this does apply to the opening. And I'll show you a quick example. Bishop b5, a6. Okay. The only time when you should exchange a bishop for a knight is the following. You either gain an important tempo, or you wreck your opponent's pawn structure. And so in this example, we have a very classical opening, which is called the Ruy-Lopez exchange. And strategically, we could say that it's a sound move. Okay, so never exchange your bishop unless you're gaining time by exchanging that piece, or you're actually gaining a positional advantage, like wrecking your opponent's pawn structure. Okay, that's pretty much what I could say about the bishop. I think that the next piece that should be talked about is the king in chess, okay, or in the opening. And the reason why we should talk about the king is because, okay, well, the concepts that we hear, or the principles, are that you should castle your king, and preferably to the king side. And the other one, that's one. And the other thing that I don't think is really talked about that much, but I could show you, is the following. After knight to c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, castles, knight to f6, d3. Okay, why does white castle? Or why do you castle in chess? We castle, the most primitive answer is because we're placing our kings in a house, basically. This is like the king's little house, okay? And that's like his, it's like you're putting him in safety, basically, okay? That way, he doesn't come under attack from your opponent's pieces. Now, the other thing about castling that needs to be pointed out is that it's actually aiding the development of your pieces. Now, what do I mean by that? I'll show you an example. You're actually bringing this piece into play, okay? And so after, let's say, d6, castles, knight c3, d6, bishop to g5, queen e7. Actually, let's not play queen e7. Let's play bishop d7, queen to e2. By castling, you're contributing to putting these the rooks, connecting the rooks, or making them communicate. You see, they both face each other, and this typically means that you've completed development, and on top of that, that you're getting ready to develop your rooks. Okay, and we'll talk about the rooks in a second. Now, so the king. The next piece I think we should talk about is the queen. And what we hear about the queen in the opening phase of the game is that we shouldn't develop our queen as in the opening phase of the game, okay? And for a lot of you that are watching this lecture, I just want to tell you some basic, they're good rules of thumb, basically, to help you remember or to identify at what phase of the game you're on. You know, usually when you castle your king and you've developed every single piece at least once, we could see that you're in the middle game. And in the end game, a good way to identify that you're in the end game is if you've exchanged a lot of pieces, primarily the queens. Okay, so in the opening, the reason why we don't want to develop our queen out too early is because she becomes very vulnerable. She's vulnerable to attacks by the pieces. So maybe I could show you a quick example. This is a very common position in chess. I know a lot of you have seen it. And black gets checkmated very easily, right? But a correct way of playing in this position, and it's a good example of why you shouldn't develop your queen out early, is knight to f6. And you might be asking yourself, oh, well, why? You know, we're surrendering a pawn in the center. Okay? Well, we learned something interesting about chess. And that's that even though you might be down a pawn, even though you might be a pawn down, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're lost in the game. And I'll show you exactly what that's like. You see, in a position like this, black is actually gaining a lot of tempos or time in development. White has 2 pieces developed, black has 4 pieces developed. I consider castling a development move, other people's don't, and the rook is semi-developed now. So I'd say, you know, this is my way of looking at chess. I'd say that black has 4.5 moves of development, and white has 2 moves of development. And it's actually white's turn, and so he will catch up by 1 move. But I would like to say that this is a good example of why you shouldn't move your queen out too early, and that's because the opening is a struggle of time and space. You're actually helping your opponent accomplish his goal a lot faster than you are. The second thing about the queen that I could probably mention is something that's it's basically logic or common sense. Okay. As you all know, the queen is the strongest piece in the chess game, and that's because it's the most valuable one. And the reason why it's the most valuable one is because it has, it's very flexible and it can move to the most squares. Okay, so really, what you should be trying to do in the opening is to develop your pieces, which are the ones you're gonna have a hard time finding squares to, and then in the end, you can develop your queen because that's the one that you're gonna have the least problems finding a square to develop to or to develop. Okay, And I think we're almost done. The last piece we'll talk about are the rooks. And I really don't know any opening principles with the rooks, but I could just tell you some very simple characteristics of the rooks themselves. And a quick example would be the following: knight to c6, bishop to b5, d6, castles, knight f6, rook e1, bishop e7, d4, pawn takes, knight takes, bishop here, takes, pawn takes, knight c3, castles. And so the game will go something like this, okay? And rooks are pieces that belong on open files. For instance, if we take a look at this rook right here, right now it really doesn't have that much potential. But if you place it on b8, now this is a semi-open file because there's actually a b pawn there. It'd be considered an open file if the pawn wouldn't be there. So when you place the rooks on open files, you're placing them in basically where they belong, because they actually have purpose now in the game. You see the rook controls all of those squares. So that's the first case. If you have an open file, then you want, or a semi-open file, you want to place your rooks on those files. Okay. Now, if you don't have an open file, okay, and we'll go very quickly. This is what we would like to, or how we would like to develop our pieces. Okay, bishop to c5. You want to centralize your rooks. Okay, what would that look like? See, you place one rook in the center. And the other rook goes to the center. And why do you place them in the center? Because indirectly, they are hitting the squares that have the greatest significance on the board, and it will lead us to the last goal of the opening, which is to open lines for your pieces. And so opening lines would look something like this: a pawn push like d4. Now in this case, this actually loses a pawn, but this is just a rough example of how a game would proceed, and that's what opening lines would look like. Okay. So to conclude, I could say that the three main goals in the opening are the following. You want to develop your pieces as quickly as possible, and by pieces, remember, we're not talking about pawns. We want to centralize our pieces, in other words, to develop in a way that your pieces have the greatest influence over the center, and we want to open lines for our pieces. And the reason why we want to open lines is because when we open lines, we maximize the value of our pieces, and in essence, we could attack, and is how a game would continue. Okay? Thank you very much, everyone. This is Charles Galofre signing off.